Hello everyone, I'm Asadullah Khan Wazir. I hope you all are doing great. Today we will discuss the US-China trade war and its future trajectory. Alongside with that, we will explore the Chinese vision of economic and technological development. And most importantly, we will analyze the expansion of CPEC into Afghanistan. I have a very special guest to discuss all these topics who has joined me all the way from Fudan University, China. So I have with me Mr. Zhang Zhipeng. He holds a PhD in Marxist philosophy from Fudan University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher there. His work explores Marxist philosophy of technology, critiques of technological capitalism, and the relationship between society and technology, with a recent focus on artificial intelligence, ethics, industrial digitization, and global AI governance. Mr. Zhang, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure having you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good, Mr. Wazir. Thank you very much. I'm honored to have this opportunity to have this interview or this talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. First of all, I would like to have your analysis on the recent joint statement on China-US economic and trade meeting in Geneva, where both countries decided to pause tariff for 90 days. How do you see this development as during the initial days of Donald Trump's second term presidency? He was using very harsh tones against China and was expecting that China would request for a trade deal, but that didn't happen. So do you think so this temporary de-escalation reflect a tactical retreat by the US capitalist system, or does it signal a deeper, a structural shift where Western protectionism can no longer suppress China's approach to economic and technological development?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the way that you put the question is already, catching the gist of my answer. The Geneva Joint Statement shows the tariff rollback, and this rollback, in fact, demonstrates America is being forced to concede. So this is a concession on the part of the US, and I would say this is a telling sign of the declining capacity of America to sustain its global economic, the domination against other countries, including China. But then we saw this kind of a tariff trade war between different giants, the superpowers back then in 19th century or at the beginning of the 20th century. But back then it was between Britain and the then emerging America. But then unlike this 19th century Britain's temporary tariff maneuvers against another capitalist rival, i.e. the US, this US retreat, as was shown in this joint statement, stems from structural weakness. As you put it, it's a structural shift. The US protectionist toolkit is actually failing against other countries, including China, and failing against this emerging new global economic order. So the US retreat demonstrates that, I would say, as Karl Marx predicted, the attempt to artificially suppress advanced productive forces through tariffs, through sanctions, but these attempts would ultimately backfire. And China's economic resilience, resilience as was already demonstrated in the EV sector and the 5G self-sufficiency, proves that this socialism with Chinese characteristics and the socialist planning actually can outperform the capitalist crisis management capacity. So the US, facing inflation and the supply chain chaos, had to concede. The US has to concede because it's zero-sum logic, zero-sum game logic. When it evaluates the global economic situation, collided and collides with material reality. And that reality is the globalized production can't be unilaterally controlled by one superpower.
Mr. Zhang, as you mentioned about Britain and American trade war during the late 19th and 20th centuries, where Britain adopted various trade restrictive measures, including tariffs against America, in order to preserve its economic hegemony. So, how do the containment policies of America against China in tariffs, trade, and technology can be compared with those of Britain toward America a century ago?
Okay. Again, this is a very good question. And now I would like to emphasize the difference, the fundamental difference between Britain's 19th century tariffs against America and today's US containment policies against China. And the difference, I guess, touches upon a core subject of Marxist analysis of history, i.e., that capitalism being replaced by, or in more philosophical, more conceptual terms, being sublated into socialism, the next stage of human development. So when Britain imposed the trade restrictions on the then rising America, it was essentially intra-capitalist competition, the competition between or within the capitalist countries, two capitalist powers wrestling with each other within the same economic system. Both were capitalist states competing for dominance within the global market. So it was like the intra-war or the intra-conflict within the capitalist regime, within the capitalist camp. But today's US-China conflict represents something qualitatively fundamentally different. It is the crisis of the late stage capitalism confronting a thriving, growing socialist alternative. So where the 19th century Britain feared losing its top capitalist position, its domination over the global market, today's America fears something far more, let's say, existential for capitalism per se. The demonstration that a non-capitalist development model, that is the socialism with Chinese characteristics, can outperform neoliberalism, which it seems that has been proved to be effective since the 1980s. But then now this effect is being questioned. Now, China's rise through socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the Chinese path to modernization, or Chinese modernization for short, challenges capitalism's claim to being a legitimate economic system, or the only modern economic system. Now, America's response, combining tariffs, tech bans like the Huawei ban, and supply chain sabotage, exposes actually capitalism's historical limits, the limits of capitalism at this stage of history. Unlike Britain's defensive measures against a fellow capitalist rival, America's actions against China shows the systematic panic of capitalism in general. Let's think of America's Chips and Science Act and the Huawei ban. These policies are not normal competition, but they are attempts to artificially suppress new productive forces that threaten US technological dominance or hegemony. Ultimately, where Britain's tariffs delayed America's capitalist rise temporarily back then, today's containment policies, containment efforts from America, I would say, will fail against China because they oppose historical progress itself, what Karl Marx called the inevitable development of new modes of production. So China's social system, the socialism with Chinese characteristics, I think embodies this historical movement, this historical trend, in a way that the 19th century America or the 21st century America never could and never can. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Zhang, do you think so both countries, China and the US, will be able to ink a trade deal?
A treaty?
Yeah, trade deal.
Yeah, I think that is very possible. It's very likely to happen because this trend or this possibility is already demonstrated within this joint statement released in Geneva over a week ago. This time, like I said, we see the concession on the part of America, and this very concession actually can be interpreted as, a historical inflection point.
Yeah.
And at this inflection point, the West is running out of the tools in its toolkit for the
Yeah.
world domination. So the West's tools of economic coercion are losing potency against socialist development models, as we can see, for example, the model of China. So as in all transitions, the old order's tactical retreats precedes its systematic collapse. But before that total collapse takes place, of course, we can see some concessions, and sometimes the concession will take the form of a treaty between the US, and other countries. But I would like to add something more. The US is making this concession. The US will likely enter into such a treaty not because it likes this, but because it has no other choice.
Yeah, they don't have any option. Yeah. Okay, Mr. Zhang, we heard a very good news few days back that China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan decided to extend or expand the CPEC into Afghanistan, and they decided to promote economic regionalism and diplomacy. So, how do you see this significance of expanding CPEC into Afghanistan, and why is it important to take on board Afghanistan to foster the environment of economic development in the region?
Yeah, that's indeed good news. I think the expansion of the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, into Afghanistan holds profound significance for these three countries, and even for this region in Asia. Now, unlike the Western powers that have exploited Afghanistan in the past for geopolitical gains, and by doing that, they left behind instability and unilateral dependency.
Exactly.
China's approach prioritizes dialogue instead of disputes, instead of domination, and prioritizes infrastructure-led development. So China is focusing on helping the Afghanistan and Pakistan to upgrade its infrastructure, to boost the economic development. And also, China's approach values mutual benefit. So this is not unilateral dominance or unilateral exploitation. So by integrating Afghanistan into CPEC, China is challenging the, I would say, imperialist logic of the uneven development, and back then, the uneven development that was designed on purpose by Western powers. So China is doing something totally different. Instead, China is fostering productive forces, helping these two countries to build the roads, energy projects, and trade routes, etc., that would empower both Pakistan and Afghanistan's self-sustained capacity to grow, economically speaking. So this move is crucial because Afghanistan, long trapped in the cycles of the war and economic sabotage by the foreign interventions, needs an alternative model, an alternative path to develop itself. So while the US, for example, imposed neoliberal reforms, conditional aid, and all that stuff, and a military occupation, China offers non-conditional economic partnership and zero tariff trade, infrastructure investment, and mineral development, you name it. So these efforts from China actually align with Afghanistan's sovereignty, because China respects the sovereignty of other countries when they are doing business. So CPEC's extension to include Afghanistan could transform Afghanistan from a war-torn periphery into a regional trade hub, hopefully connecting Central Asia and South Asia, while reducing its reliance on Western aid. And one last thing, China's emphasis, on shared governance, as seen in trilateral dialogues with Afghanistan and Pakistan, which has been taking place for several times in the past few years, contrasts sharply with the US unilateralism. So by fostering economic, not unilateral dependence, but interdependence, that is cooperation, rather than domination, China's model, China's approach, presents a, I would say, a new model, a new vision of international relations, one where stability emerges from development and mutual benefit, not from coercion.
Mr. Zhang, you have rightly pointed out the China's approach to regional development and its emphasis on win-win cooperation, economic cooperation, and stability. But when we see the belligerent rule and hegemonic attitude of India in the South Asia, so do you see any prospect of economic regionalism in South Asia?
Well, that is a question that needs continuous observation and study, of course. South Asia's economic integration, yes, faces challenges for now due to, as you have pointed out, the aggressive posture of India and the region's proxy conflicts. But I would like to point out, I would like to emphasize that these conflicts actually are legacies of imperialist interference, imperialist interventions, left by the Western powers last century that continue to serve Western geopolitical interests. We have to see through, the phenomenon of the conflicts, but into the very essence of this problem. So they are the legacies of the imperialist interference of Western powers. Now, in stark contrast, like we said, China's approach to international relations offers something different, a new vision of international relations, demonstrating, how development and cooperation and interdependence can be achieved through dialogue instead of confrontation. So I would say, I think there is the promising prospect of economic regionalism, economic cooperation in South Asia, if we take seriously, the new approach, the new vision put forward by China. This time, this new vision of international relations of China emphasizes openness, shared benefits, mutual benefits, and shared governance, collective governance. So this would present a fundamental challenge, to the existing power structures that were heavily influenced by the Western domination, the Western imperialism. So through initiatives like, the Belt and Road, the China promotes win-win cooperation, like you pointed out, that enhances regional connectivity, and at the same time, respecting each country's sovereignty. So if we stick to this model, if we, put more efforts into promoting the Belt and Road Initiative, I would say, yes, there is the prospect of regionalism in South Asia.
Okay, Mr. Zhang, when we see the Western media, there is a perception being propagated by the Western intelligentsia that China's cooperation with developing world is basically China is trapping them in a debt. So do you really think so Chinese investment are debt traps?
The death trap narrative, like many other narratives, is a classical example of the ideological distortion by Western powers to discredit China's efforts, to discredit China's development partnerships. Historically, if we look into the details of the history, historically, it is the US and the IMF, which was really controlled by the US, that perfected debt imperialism. That is, they were using loans to force privatization, austerity, and resource extraction on the global South countries. Let's think about the lost decade of Latin America, right? China's approach, again, offers something different, fundamentally different. Yes, China also offers infrastructure loans, but unlike the Western conditional aid, the loans from China don't demand neoliberal reforms or military bases. So from a Marxist perspective, I would say the debt trap narrative is actually a smear campaign, from the capitalist camp. And this smear campaign reflects capitalism's crisis of legitimacy. So as China helps, the other global South countries to build railways, like railways in Africa, and the ports in Southeast Asia, like the ports in Sri Lanka, enhancing these countries' productive forces and economic infrastructure. It exposes, China's efforts expose the failure of Western aid that kept the developing countries, dependent. Or we can think of the Hambantota port case. This port project is often mislabeled a debt trap, but actually, this very
Even
case
CPEC is
shows Sri
mislabeled as
Lanka's
debt trap.
the pre-existing Western debt burdens, right? Debt trap was already caused by the Western powers before China entered onto the stage. So the only trap is, I would say, the Western anxiety over losing its monopoly on exploitation and losing its monopoly on controlling the narratives. So China's cooperation model, the new vision for international relations, yes, it will continue to develop. Nothing is perfect at the very beginning, but then China's cooperation model offers developing countries a new choice, what capitalism never did. That is a path to industrial sovereignty without having to, surrender over part of the sovereignty. So this is a woman's situation, and this is a equal development, equal relationship between different countries working together.
Mr. Zhang, there is a connected question with my previous question, and you already know that Donald Trump has closed different US departments, including USAID. So I would like to have your comment on this question, that how China is replacing US role in terms of providing financial aid or financial assistance to the developing world.
This question, I would say, is related to the previous question, right?
Yeah.
So from my perspective, China's rise as a leading provider of the aid, of the financial aid, financial assistance to the global South countries reflects the shifting balance of global economic power. So this is a transition from the US-led capitalist hegemony toward a more multipolar global order, a multipolar economic order. So unlike the US, which historically used aid, like I said, for the previous question, as a tool for geopolitical control, for example, we can think of the Point 4 program during the Cold War era.
Yeah.
So China's approach aligns with Karl Marx's critique of capitalist exploitation. So when China is offering the loans, the aid, the assistance to other countries, it is not for the purpose of exploiting these countries, but actually this is done on the basis of mutual development and mutual benefits, rather than unilateral dependency, rather than extracting the values, the resources from one country to serve another. So China's assistance through infrastructure, for example, I mentioned already for the previous question, the Belt and Road Initiative projects, the railways and the ports in Africa and South Asia. China's infrastructure loans, the debt relief, and China was waiving interest-free loans for the least developed countries, and technology transfer, of course, like China helps the other countries to grow the hybrid rice, to build the solar energy sector. These efforts, or these kind of assistance from China, focuses on promoting the productive forces of the developing countries so that they can develop by themselves in the future. And China is trying to enable the self-sustained growth of these developing countries. So this contrasts sharply with the US aid, which often imposed neoliberal reforms. Like I said, you will have to reform your economic system, sometimes even your political system, according to the neoliberal ideologies, according to the demands of the US. But China is not doing that. So again, China's approach, for providing financial and other kinds of assistance to the developing countries, challenges the imperialist model or the imperialist logic of the uneven development, uneven exchange, by rejecting political strengths. So the US weaponized aid to maintain its unipolar dominance, but China is doing something totally different. We are using the aid to promote a multipolar mutually benefiting global order.
Mr. Zhang, as you talked about China's unique approach to development and technology, so my question is, how do you think the localized innovation and South-South cooperation pursued by countries like China provide or potentially generate an alternative models to challenge the Western-dominated technology capital complex?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have an optimistic attitude towards the answer to the question. I mean, the answer is yes. China's push for localized innovation and the South-South cooperation represents the most significant challenge in technological hegemony. This isn't just about, catching up for the developing countries. It's an attempt to rewrite, to reformulate the rules of the global technology capital complex that has maintained Western dominance since the Industrial Revolution. So the success of this alternative model hinges on three crucial factors. Of course, there are conditions for this model to be successful. First, the ability to achieve genuine technological independence. The key word here is technological independence, not just in manufacturing chips, but also in setting global standards, the technological standards. We can think of the example of China's Beidou navigation system. Yeah. Beidou navigation system challenges GPS, and this challenge shows that this is possible. I mean, it is possible for the developing countries, to gain technological independence and to get into the system of setting the global standards, technological standards. Second condition, creating South-South partnerships based on technology transfer rather than technology extraction. China's vaccine diplomacy during the COVID-19 epidemic demonstrated this potential. China was able to develop the high-tech vaccines, and it was willing to share the technology with other developing countries and also developed countries too. Third, and most importantly, developing a new paradigm where technological progress isn't hostage to profit maximization, which is the key aim, the key idea of capitalism. As seen in China's state-driven green energy sector, green energy transition outpacing the Western markets. So China is promoting the transition into the green energy stage, not just driven by more profit, but by driven by a vision, for a better, for a well-protected environment and a shared future. However, the Western techno-capital complex won't just surrender quietly. So its sanctions, its co-option, the co-option to absorb successful alternatives has worked for centuries, at least for decades. So the real test will be whether China and the South partners of China can sustain the innovation while resisting these pressures, the pressures of being put under the economic and technological sanctions and technological co-option.
Okay, my last question from you is that in view of your research on technology and society, can the US imposition of tariffs on Chinese high-tech products can be viewed as the continuation of technological capitalism? And what structural impacts might these techno-trade hegemonism complex have on the global knowledge production system?
Yeah, absolutely. The US tariffs on China high-tech goods are not just about trade. They are a kind of technological colonialism, which is designed on purpose to maintain the US monopoly, or the Western monopoly in general. The American monopoly over the production of knowledge and the advanced technological products reflects the capital's imperative to control the means of production, but only in this field, the means of intellectual production, as it once did with the factories and the lands, i.e. the traditional, the material means of production. So structurally, these policies from the US would reinforce a center-periphery divide, in the field of technology transfer in global knowledge systems by restricting China's access to chips, to AI or green tech. The US aims to, I think, stifle the productive forces in the global South, keeping them dependent on the R&D and the patent system of the Western countries, serving the interest of the Western countries. This is nothing new. Again, think of how the 19th century Britain, back then Britain blocked industrial machinery exports to colonies, including the US. So today's innovation blockade follows the same logic. US is doing what Britain did over a century ago, but with semiconductors this time instead of the textile machinery. And what is the long-term impact? I think the artificial sagacity would be the long-term impact of the technological containment policies of the US. And this artificial sagacity of the knowledge products, of the high-tech products, would be detrimental to all countries across the globe. So by fragmenting the global tech supply chains, the tariffs from the US would slow collective progress, the progress for the entire humanity on crises like climate change, while inflating the profits for Silicon Valley tech companies. So the only companies that would benefit from this kind of tech tariffs would be the Silicon Valley giants. But then these tech companies only represent a very small fraction of all the companies of all countries. Meanwhile, developing countries, under the pressure of these kind of tech tariff policies, are faced with forced de-skilling as they are denied the tools, to climb the value chain. Again, this is designed on purpose by the US and the Western powers. So the real alternatives would require dismantling this techno-feudalism. But I'm not using this term feudalism in a very strict academic sense, but you get the idea. The open source, the open collaboration, like that we see in the free and open source software movement, and the democratic technological governance, the shared governance proposed by China, could help to break free from these barriers. But again, this very attempt would threaten the rent-seeking model of capitalism as we know it today in Western countries like the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhang. It was pleasure having you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wazir. I'm very glad to have this chance to communicate with you over these important issues.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhang.
Thank you. You have a good day.